left off, he read, the last chapter was called Freedom of the Press. So chapter 11 is called Extra Extra. Read all about it. On Thursday morning, the Westfield Gazette newspaper was delivered to all 12,297 homes and post office boxes in Westfield. The story about Lincoln Elementary School was the first item on the front page, and the headline says, "Local fifth grader says, move over Mr. Webster." It was quite an article. Not that Judy Morgan didn't tell the truth. Every statement in the article was completely true. It was the particular way that she told the truth that got things hopping around town. For example, take this sentence about Mrs. Granger. She said, "Mrs. Granger, champion of the forces of order and authority, is battling hundreds of young Frindle fighters. Neither side is giving in." Or this bit about Nick. "Everyone agrees that Nick Allen masterminded this plot that cleverly raises issues about free speech and academic rules. He is the boy who invented the new word." Or the last sentence in the article. "One thing is for sure. The kids at Lincoln Elementary School love their Frindles, and no one seems to be backing off on this war of words." And of course, the Westfield Gazette published the class picture too, and Mrs. Granger and Nick were identified for the whole world to see who they were. What's the meaning of this? That's what Nick's mother said, putting the article in front of Nick's nose when she got home from school. "Did you talk to this reporter? She seems to know an awful lot about you and your new word, young man." "What's the meaning of this?" That's what the school superintendent said to Mrs. Chapman, slapping a copy of the article on their desk. "Why did you have to talk to that reporter? Don't we have enough trouble getting the taxpayers to pay for schools without articles like this banging around the town?" "What is the meaning of this?" That's what Mrs. Chapman said to Mrs. Granger, shaking the newspaper in front of her face. "I know you said you had to talk to this woman, but you did not have to say all these things. It will be a wonder if we don't all get fired." It was a quiet Thursday for everyone, and no one could figure out how Judy Morgan had gotten that class 5th grade picture. Chapter 12, Airwaves. Within a week after the article was published in the Westfield Gazette, the kids at the junior high and the kids at the high school had stopped using the word pen and had started using the word Frindle, and they loved it. Nick became sort of a hero for the kids all over town and quickly learned that being a hero, even if you're only a local hero, is not a free ride. It has its price. People noticed Nick when he walked into his dad's hardware store or when he stood in line at the penny pantry to buy a candy bar, and he could feel it when someone recognized him and it made him shy and awkward. Kids at school started expecting him to be clever and funny all the time, and even for a kid as smart as Nick, that was asking a lot. Every teacher, the office secretary, the principal, even the school nurse and the custodian all seemed to be watching. Always watching. His parents were great about everything. True, his mom had been a little upset when the article first came out, and so had his dad. But Nick had said, "But I didn't do anything wrong, Mom," and neither did that lady from the newspaper. And his parents could see he was right. The things in the article were true, and the truth is the truth, and nothing could be done about it now, even though it made them uncomfortable to have their boy talked about all over town. Secretly, Nick's mom and dad were happy. After all, a brand new word is a pretty amazing thing. Their Nicholas was quite a fellow. No getting around that. Someone else in town thought this brand new word was pretty amazing too. Bud Lawrence. Bud had lived all of his life in Westfield, and when he was only 19 years old, he had saved enough money to make an investment. He looked around for a good idea, and then he bought the first Dairy Queen in the state. After a few years, he bought a McDonald's restaurant that was almost 30 years ago, and these two restaurants had made him rich and one of Westfield's richest and most leading citizens. When Bud Lawrence saw the article about the new word, he had his lawyer file a preliminary trademark on the word Frindle. So preliminary means beginning, like the start, and trademark is what a company does. So if you look at anything, like I have a bottle of hand sanitizer right here, and next to the name Purell, you'll see it all the time, there's that little, I don't know, it's kind of blurry, that little R in a circle or a TM in a circle. That means trademark or registered trademark. And you cannot go and make a new product called Purell because this company now owns that name. So no one else could use that. You could get sued or in trouble with the law because the Purell company says, "Nope, we want that word. We're going to call our stuff Purell," and no one else can use it. So this guy said, "Hey, I'm going to trademark the name or the word Frindle." Within 4 days, this man had set up a small company and he was selling cheap plastic pens, specially marked with the word Frindle. He sold 3,000 Frindles in the first week, and they sold so fast in stores all over Westfield that they couldn't keep them in stock. Then, just as quickly, kids stopped asking for Frindles and sales slowed down. But Bud Lawrence started thinking about new projects. A week later was Halloween, and the leaves started falling, and it seemed like the town was going quiet again. And it would have been if it had not been for Alice Lunderson. Alice lived in Betherly, a town 7 miles away, and she worked for a local TV station in Carrington, a town of about 75,000 people. When there was important area news like floods or tornadoes, or sometimes if she came across little stories that seemed cute or original, Alice would call the station news manager in Carrington. If it was a good story, or if it was a day when not much else was going on, the TV station would send out a van with a camera crew and they would shoot some video. Alice subscribed to all the small town newspapers to keep up with local events. Most of them were published on Thursday and they arrived at her house by Monday or Tuesday. And it took her a day or two to look through them all. So Wednesday morning, she finally saw the newspaper article in the Westfield Gazette about the word war. She read it through twice and she looked carefully at the class picture. She was sure this story would be a winner. The TV station manager in Carrington agreed, and he called the CBS station in Boston because sometimes Boston picked up stories from their newsroom. The woman in Boston thought the story had a real zip to it, so she called the network news editor in New York. And when the facts of the Westfield Gazette got an article to the New York, the staff there loved it. They looked all over the schedule sheet for the week and decided it would be the perfect closing story for the CBS News for the next day, on Thursday. Orders flew back through the telephone links from New York to Boston and from Carrington to Betherly. And by Wednesday at noon, Alice had the go to take the story all the way. It was her first piece to get national news. 20 million viewers would see this. Alice Lunderson and her camera crew stood on Mrs. Granger's front porch on Wednesday after school. Mrs. Granger was not impressed by all the lights and the microphones. She looked right into the camera and said, "I have always said that the dictionary is the finest tool ever created for young minds, and I still say that. Children need to understand that there are rules about words and language, and that those rules have a history that makes sense. And to pretend that a perfectly good English word can be replaced by a silly made-up word just for the fun of it, well, that is something I was ready to stand by and watch without a fight." And have you lost that fight, Mrs. Granger? The reporter asked her. Mrs. Granger's eyes turned to full power, and she looked into the camera with a pale smile and said, "It's not over yet." When Alice and the crew showed up at Nick's house and the Allen family was ready for them, Mom and Dad sat on the couch with Nick between them. Nick squinted into the lights. His mom had worked out with Nick what he would say and what he couldn't say. "You remember, young man," she told him as she combed his hair, "these reporters are just looking for a quick story with excitement. But you have to stay here and live here in this town. So you mind your P's and Q's." As they sat there on the couch, Mrs. Allen had her foot on top of Nick's under the coffee table. And if she pushed hard on his foot, it meant that the reporter had just asked a question that she, his mom, was going to answer for him. Mrs. Allen did not trust the reporters. "So tell me, Nick, why did you make up this new word, Frindle?" asked the reporter. Nick gulped and said, "Well, my teacher, Mrs. Granger, said that all words in the dictionary were made up by people and that they mean what they mean because they say they do. So I thought it'd be fun to make up a new word and see if it was true." "And were you surprised when Mrs. Granger got mad about that?" asked the reporter with a smile. There was a push on Nick's foot, and his mother answered, "We never felt that Mrs. Granger got angry. When everyone started using the word Frindle, it just got to be a disruption, that's all. She's a very nice teacher." "Yes," said Nick. "I learned a lot about words, and without her, I wouldn't have." The reporter asked again, wrapping it up, "So what's next for you in the new word?" She could see that Nick and his parents were not going to be pushed into saying anything controversial, so she just kept it light and happy. "Well," said Nick, "the funny thing is I thought I invented it, but it's not my word anymore. Frindle belongs to everyone now, and I guess everyone will figure out what happens together." Alice had a short chat with a worried look at Mrs. Chapman and a smiling Bud Lawrence, maker of the official Frindle, and then she shot her opening bit and her closing bit, and the camera crew drove back home to edit all the pieces and put them together into a short 2-minute story. The next night, when all the serious news about wars and oil prices and food supplies had been talked about on the CBS Evening News, the anchorman looked in the camera and smiled and said, It is believed by many that the word quiz was made up in 1791 by a Dublin theater manager. He had bet someone that he could invent a brand new word in the English language, and he chalked up the letters Q-U-I-Z and wrote them on every wall in town. The next morning, there it was, and within a week, people all over Ireland was wondering what it could mean. A new word had been created. Quiz. It was the only word in English that was invented by one person for no reason. Until now. Now there's a new word here. Frindle. And Alice Lunderson is in New Hampshire with that story. Alice came on the screen with a short introduction. Then, right there on TV, Mrs. Granger, Nick, and Bud Lawrence and Nick's mom were talking to 20 million people about Frindles. One of those 20 million people was a producer of The Late Show with David Letterman. And another of those 20 million people was a staff writer of People magazine. And another was the writer for 321 Contact magazine for kids. Dozens of other writers and producers and marketing people saw the story on the news, and all of them smelled a great story. So here is Nick. Let's see where that picture is. There's Nick with his Frindle and the news person. During the next 3 weeks, every man, woman, and child in America heard about the funny new word that kids were using instead of pen. And kids in Ohio and Iowa and New York and Texas and California started using the word too. Bud Lawrence was suddenly flooded with orders for anything with the word Frindle on it. And he quickly got interested again. But there were complications. Bud's lawyer said, "You see that stack of orders there? Trouble, that's what it is. We got a trademark filed, but it's only like an application. The whole country knows that little kid made up the word, and unless you make a deal with his dad, you're going to end up with nothing. Maybe in a big fat lawsuit. That kid owns the word." When Nick's mom came home at lunchtime, his wife told him that he had to call Bud Lawrence. "It's something about that new word," he said. This was not good news to Tom Allen. He was sick and tired of all the fuss, and being away from the hardware store so much while all this nonsense was happening had put him weeks behind on his paperwork. He'd be lucky to get his orders done in time for Christmas. And even though he didn't really want anything to do with it, Bud was an old friend. So on the way back to the store, Nick's dad went to Bud Lawrence's office. "Tom, it's good to see ya," said Bud. He stood up and walked around his desk and shook his hand. "Have a seat," Tom said uneasily, and Bud pulled out another chair. "Ever seen Westfield so stirred up about anything in your life? You and Ginny must be so proud of, that boy of yours." He couldn't even remember Nick's name. Tom shifted in his chair. "Yeah, he's something. But I tell you, Bud, I'm ready for it just to die down. It's too much fuss." Instantly, Bud saw how to get what he wanted. "Well, Tom, I'm afraid this isn't going to go away. Looks like something started up and people are real interested. You probably saw those bright red ballpoint pens around town with the word Frindle on them, didn't you? That was my doing, just testing the waters. But your boy, he owns that word, and I got my lawyer to apply for a trademark a few weeks ago because that was just the way I am. New things come along, I like to be on top of it." He grinned at Tom and Al, and he smiled weakly. "Right now, I got a shirt printer in Massachusetts and another in Chicago and Los Angeles making shirts with the word Frindle written all over it with the pen. With a Frindle," he said. "Each supplier has orders for over 20,000 t-shirts. Profit on each of these is going to be $2, maybe $3. And I'm talking with some big pen and pencil companies in Hong Kong and Japan about a deal that could be worth something real big money. They've seen this Frindle thing in the media. They want to buy the rights and trademark it and make a new line of Frindle for kids. I'm not kidding. This idea is hot." Bud guessed right. Just the thought of all that made Tom shrink back uncomfortably in his chair. It was too much fuss for him. "Tom, let me be direct with you. As the boy's guardian, you need to do the right thing about all this. I'd like to see where all this is going to go. I'm going to take some risks and spend some money, but I need your permission. I need your signature for these pens. I know it seems like a big ruckus about a word, but we can't just let it all come unless we take some steps." Bud pointed to some papers on his desk. "That is a contract, fair and honest. It gives your boy 30% of whatever money I make. That is so kind of me. So what do you say? Makes sense? Let's take care of all this fuss and see if some good doesn't come out of it." The papers and the pen were there on the desk next to Tom. He looked at Bud and then he reached over and picked up the pen, and he signed both copies of the paper. "I've got no reason to doubt you one bit, Bud, and I sure don't want to mess any of this up with myself. Is that it?" he asked. So I think this guy just lied to the dad. "Not quite, Tom. Here, Then Bud Lawrence handed Nick's dad a check for $2,225. What's this? Oh, that's what I owe Nick for the sales of Frindles from the first 3 weeks. Tom looked at the check and said, "This is terrific, Bud, and I'm really glad about it because I'm sure it'll help with Nick's college, but I wish you'd just keep this between us. If Nick knew he'd probably stop mowing lawns and I'd never get him to save another penny, so let's just keep this money between us." "Sure, Tom, I understand, just between us," and they shook hands. Mr. Allen left Bud's office and walked across the street to the savings bank. He set up a bank account for Nick, and the bank manager said he could make arrangements with Mr. Lawrence so any other money could be put in there automatically. Sounded good to Tom Allen. If he never heard another word about it, Frindle, that would be fine. As Nick's dad walked slowly back to the hardware store, he wondered if things were ever going to be the same again in his quiet little town. And that is the end of chapter